This is apropos. Absolutely unacceptable. That's the verdict from EU trade ministers after Donald Trump said he'd be imposing tariffs of 30% on the European Union from next month. Brussels is accusing the United States of resisting efforts to strike a trade deal and warning of countermeasures if no agreement is reached between now and the 1st of August. Vedika Bahel has the latest.
The European Union is choosing negotiation over retaliation, at least for now. In Brussels, the EU Commission President said hard-hitting retaliatory tariffs on US goods won't come into force next week as planned, and instead only activated if a deal can't be reached.
We have always been very clear that we prefer a negotiated solution. This remains the case, and we will use the time that we have now till the 1st of August. Since the very beginning, we have worked and now are ready to respond with countermeasures. We've prepared for this, and we can respond with countermeasures if necessary.
Brussels was blindsided by Trump's Saturday announcement of a 30% blanket tariff on imports from the EU, starting August 1st, which he blamed on the trade imbalance in goods with Europe. The French president has called for a show of force against Trump, including considering deploying its anti-coercion instrument, or trade bazooka if required.
With European unity, it's more than ever up to the Commission to assert the Union's determination to resolutely defend European interests. In particular, this implies speeding up the preparation of credible countermeasures by mobilizing all the instruments at its disposal, including anti-coercion, if no agreement is reached by August 1st.
Brussels has ramped up efforts to forge new agreements with South American and Asian trading partners, following Washington's global trade war. The EU is the world's largest trading bloc and America's biggest trading partner, with its top exports to the US being pharmaceuticals, cars, aircraft, chemicals and wine and spirits.
Well, for more, let's bring in Gavin Bade, a reporter specialising in trade and economic policy at the Wall Street Journal. Gavin, thanks so much for being with us this evening. So the markets, most of them, they appear to be essentially shrugging off Donald Trump's latest tariff threats towards the EU and Mexico. So is this simply another negotiating ploy? What is Donald Trump planning to do here? Is it possible to say?
I think it's impossible to say for certain, but certainly that's how the markets are taking this, and that's the feeling in Washington around Capitol Hill is this is just the latest negotiating tactic from Trump. You know, he's seen a lot of outlines from trade deals, we understand, and he's directed his staff to go back and make one final push to get the best provisions that he can from his perspective. And so just to jack up the pressure, you know, he did kick off the, push back the deadline to institute these tariffs by 3 weeks. And I think to kind of increase the pressure at the same time, he started writing these letters upping the ante in these negotiations. So some heady days to come of talks between different trading partners.
How real is the risk then that these tariffs are going to be imposed in a couple of weeks' time then?
I think it's certainly real that we will see tariffs snap back into place if we don't see some sort of deal between the U.S. and the EU and other economies. That being said, there will probably be tariffs on the EU, even if there is some sort of deal. They'll just be at a lower level. I think President Trump has been adamant that every country was at least going to see a 10% baseline tariff, and then separately would face automotive tariffs and other industry-specific tariffs. So we're certainly some level of tariff increases coming. I think we're just haggling over how much that's going to be right now.
And in terms of the haggling then, how do you think the EU should respond? Not all nations are agreed with what they should do next. France, for example, among those calling for kind of firmer countermeasures against the US.
Yeah, I think maybe in this case, it's good to have a good cop, bad cop situation going on with the EU, where you can have Ursula von der Leyen delay the official retaliation and then have kind of the scepter of the anti-coercion mechanism that Macron wants to institute or at least think about using. I think it's probably a smart thing at this point to not retaliate against Trump. If he has kicked the deadline out, then maybe it's smart to extend as well, see if you can come to a deal. But there's going to be a time, we're going to come to a moment where we simply can't extend a deadline anymore. And I think it's anyone's guess as to what happens at that point. Thinking back to April, we saw a lot of market chaos when the reciprocal tariffs were actually in place for a week. So hopefully cooler heads can prevail here.
And how much pressure is Brussels coming under, though? You know, it's facing potentially a huge economic blow, particularly when it comes to certain industries like, car industry, pharmaceuticals, consumer industry, and even within Europe, different countries are going to be affected differently.
Yeah, and I think it's a big task for the European Commission, for Ursula von der Leyen, to wrangle all those cats and get all those economies together to agree to a deal. Obviously, there's a lot of different interests in the 27 member states, and some people some of them may be more amenable to a deal and others may not be. We already see with Macron wanting to take a harder line. So there's going to be a variety of negotiating tactics within the bloc as well as, between the two governments. I think it's a very challenging thing.
And how many countries actually have succeeded at this point in reaching a deal with Trump, and how have they managed to appease him?
Well, success is a relative term here. We kind of have 2.5 or 3 deals. The US and the UK signed a narrow trade agreement. It's not legally binding, but Trump did give them a little bit of a break on the automotive tariffs and on steel and aluminum, although the details are still being worked out there. Then we saw a trade, we could call it a tariff truce with the Chinese. This was the deal back in Geneva in May that lowered the tariffs. The U.S. tariffs had got up to an eye-watering 145%. We lowered that down to around from 40 to 50%, depending on the product line. And the Chinese did lower their tariffs reciprocally as well. So that deal is still being negotiated. There's been twists and turns there. We've not seen any text. There's been no documents released about it. So we have to kind of take them at their word. And it's a similar situation with Vietnam. 2 weeks ago, Trump put out a post on Truth Social saying he had agreed to a trade deal with Vietnam. And since then, we've reported, and others have reported, that the details are not all worked out. We haven't seen any paper, no documents from that deal. It's really just that one Truth Social press release that we have as evidence that there actually is something behind this. So I think it's been slow going for the administration in many of these negotiations.
And Gavin, what do you make of Trump's latest comments about Russia threatening to impose tariffs there if the war with Ukraine doesn't end in 50 days, saying that trade is great for settling wars?
Yeah, a very vague, if serious threat. Trump was speaking at a White House event earlier today when he was with the NATO Secretary General, and he said, we will put 100% tariffs on Russia if they don't end the war within 50 days. The White House that was playing cleanup after and then saying, okay, well, he meant either tariffs or sanctions. And then the Commerce Secretary said, well, these might be secondary tariffs that would apply to countries that trade with Russia, that buy Russian oil, for instance. Then you're opening the door for much higher tariffs on the Chinese economy, for instance, the Indian economy, if these are indeed secondary tariffs. Like a lot of other things we've talked about in this discussion, there's no document, there's no plan that's been released, there's no press release. It's just Trump's kind of off-the-cuff comments. And it's been difficult to get any clarity from the White House about what this means. Now, sometimes that's the way Trump likes it. He uses ambiguity as a negotiating tool to kind of keep his adversaries off balance. But at some point, you need to come true with one of those threats, or you start to lose a little bit of negotiating leverage and credibility. So I think it remains to be seen how this threat evolves in the weeks to come here.
And you've written as well about how Trump has used punitive duties over other countries, regarding matters that, again, have nothing to do with economics or trade. You cite the case of Brazil and former President Jair Bolsonaro.
Yeah, so last week, President Trump issued one of his tariff letters threatening 50% tariffs on Brazil, principally because he said that the Brazilian legal system has treated Jair Bolsonaro, the former right-wing president, very, very unfairly. Now, remember that Bolsonaro's on trial at Brazilian Supreme Court right now for his role in fomenting an insurrection at the Brazilian capital in 2023. Trump, knowing something about insurrections, has a lot of sympathy for Bolsonaro and referenced this in his letter, saying that if they didn't, quote, leave Bolsonaro alone, he would institute these tariffs. And this just marks a huge break in economic policy making from really the last 50 years. The U.S. and other Western nations had worked very hard to come to agreements that would take tariffs out of the political realm and make them just narrower tools of economic policy. Now Trump has ripped all of that up, the general agreement on tariffs and trade, all of the WTO agreements. None of that matters to him anymore. He sees tariffs as a hammer, and he sees every global problem as a nail. And I think this is just the latest kind of expansive use or expansion of the use of tariffs for matters that have nothing to do with trade.
And Gavin, you say success is a relative term when we're talking about all this, but is Trump overall succeeding in the objectives, whatever they may be, when it comes to these tariffs? Is there actual evidence that these measures are raising revenue or encouraging firms to relocate or to move back to the US?
They're certainly raising revenue. We're bringing in tens of billions of dollars every month in these tariffs. I think the answer to the second question, are firms reshoring to the United States, is a much more uncertain one. We've seen a lot of stagnation in deal making, although we've seen some residual investments coming in. But every business leader I talk to says, how can you're not going to make a multi-billion-dollar investment if you are a trade-reliant company in the US when you don't know what the tariff rate is going to be. And so I think we have yet to see all of the impacts filter through the economy. A lot of companies are still offloading inventory that they have that they did not pay tariffs on. But I think we're going to start seeing price increases over the next, few months here. And that will really be a sticking point for Trump in months to come.
Well, Gavin, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme. It's a very interesting conversation. That's Gavin Bade, reporter specialising in trade and economic policy at the Wall Street Journal.